You are listening to Fierce Feminine Leadership, episode number 256, The Power of Showing Up as Authentically You, 100% no holds barred, with my guest, Annie Rogaski.
Welcome to Fierce Feminine Leadership, the success podcast for women in business. Each week, we feature interviews and advice to help you step into your power and lead your way. Now here's your host, women's leadership expert, Eleanor Beaton.
Hello there, Fierce Ones. Eleanor Beaton here, and welcome back to another episode of Fierce Feminine Leadership, the success podcast for ambitious women in business. This is episode number 256, and today we are talking about the power of being the authentic version of you, 100% no holds barred, with my guest, Annie Rogaski. So maybe you have been in a situation in your career where you felt that in order to be successful, you actually needed to show up as an alternate version to who you actually are. In the writer Glennon Doyle Melton's work, she talks about sending forth her representative, i.e. not showing up as herself, but going through periods in her life where she would send forth her representative. Well, the idea of sending forth a representative to act in her stead in the field of her work, which ultimately was as a patent and trademark attorney, that's an experience that Annie Rogaski spent the first part of her career doing as a highly successful lawyer in, again, trademark and patent law, a very male-dominated field where she felt that to be successful, she needed to show up essentially as a man. And I know that this is an experience that many of you may have gone through. Well, Annie's decision to change that, to take matters into her own hands, to show up as authentically herself, was not only life-changing, but it was ultimately career transforming. And in today's interview, Annie's going to take us through that decision, and she's going to talk us through some of the powerful decisions and contributions that she made after that point. Annie is a lawyer and entrepreneur. She has a passion for women's leadership and podcasts. She co-founded a women's leadership organization called The Club. It's based in Silicon Valley. It just celebrated 5 years of inspiring leadership, and the real emphasis there is on bringing women leaders together with a focus on professional advancement. She co-founded a women-owned high-tech law firm, Hip Legal. She's going to talk about where that law firm came from. It's actually the offspring of a 30-day experiment that she did with her friends and co-founders called the Joy Experiment. She's going to be telling us about that in the interview. And she is currently general counsel at a mixed reality tech startup, a Vegant. She's also the host and producer of the Unraveling Pink podcast, which tackles gender bias through conversation with men and women. So if you've heard her background, if you know my background, you know we have a ton to talk about. I really, really loved interviewing Annie. So without further ado, here is Annie Rogaski. Annie Rogaski, welcome to Fierce Feminine Leadership.
Thank you. It's so nice to be on your show.
So where are you right now, I should ask?
I am sitting on the window seat of my house in Los Altos, California.
Oh, I love it. Well, I am in basically diagonally across the continent from you right now, having not your weather. So jealous, hashtag jealous. So Annie, you are a lawyer and an entrepreneur. You are a podcast host. You are an advocate in the area of women's leadership. I would love for you to tell us about the work that you do today and how you spend your days and weeks.
Well, every day is different. I'm the general counsel of a startup company called Avagant that is in the mixed reality space, so combining augmented reality with the reality that we actually live. And it's exciting to be a part of a startup team that is doing something that I think we'll all be incorporating into our daily lives in the future. So that's an interesting space to be in. My day is different every day, in part because what I do for the company varies. As a general counsel, we cover all areas of the law. So my background is in intellectual property. I do a lot of patent and trade secret work. But then whatever happens to come up for the company, if it's on the corporate side or the employment side, I handle all aspects of the legal needs of the company. But then in my free time, I also have a podcast called Unraveling Pink. And I often spend evenings or weekends either interviewing guests or editing and publishing. And so that takes up a fair amount of my time as well.
What prompted you to start the show, Unraveling Pink?
Well, it's actually my second podcast. So the first podcast I started was in, I think, 2014. I had a law firm and we were trying to get information out to clients because it was really hard to get people to come to us for breakfast sessions and things like that. And so at the time, my husband had actually played a podcast for me and I had never heard the medium before. And I was so struck with the intimacy of hearing a conversation between two people and kind of feeling like you're in the room, but you're not. And so I became enamored with the platform and decided to educate people about intellectual property issues through a podcast. So I started Hip Perspectives then. And then when I came to Avagant, I wrapped up my law firm podcast and I kind of missed doing podcasts. At the time, I had been the president of the club, which is a women's leadership organization I founded. And what I was finding was that the women's groups were having great conversations and I think needed that support and community to elevate each other. But what I didn't see happening was men and women having conversations about women's issues and gender issues. And so I wanted to use the podcast platform to start having those conversations, to really tackle what are the gender issues that we're seeing at work and what are constructive ways that we can solve them.
So one of the things that's evident, as you talk about your decision to start the podcast, I mean, you're citing and referencing some different projects, different passion projects, and also different career focuses or foci, I should say. Mm-hmm. Can you take us through your career path? Tell us, maybe start with where you grew up, what that kind of those early years were like, and how did you get to where you are today? So like the Coles Notes version of Annie's life, My Life by Annie in 5 minutes.
Okay. I'll try to meet that 5 minutes. Yeah, so I actually grew up in California in the Bay Area where I live now about 60 miles from where I grew up. I have 2 older brothers, and so I was always a tomboy growing up and always hung out with the guys, which I think informed a lot of my path. I ended up going to Santa Barbara for college, and I studied chemistry. And I was the only female in my major. And so once again, I was with the guys, and that was fine. You get used to it. And it never really struck me until later that I never had a female professor. I never really had a female classmate. It just was the norm for me. And then I went to law school, and when I came out, I got a job in intellectual property, ended up in patent litigation. And patent litigation is a very male-dominated profession. It is usually people who have technical backgrounds, so the number of women is smaller because of the number of women in the hard sciences in college. And litigation in general is a pretty testosterone-driven profession. It's competitive, you're constantly battling, and you have to be able to withstand that battle on a day-to-day basis, which plenty of women can. But the profession had a very masculine tint to it. I very rarely saw other women in the courtroom with me. I very rarely saw other women in deposition rooms and meetings. And so it was kind of a continuation of my college experience. And at some point, I would try to go to women's events here and there, and I never really felt like I belonged there. I didn't feel like it was an environment that was helpful to my career. And so I kind of eschewed them along the way. And at one point, I was introduced to an organization called Leading Women in Technology. And it had a completely different vibe. It was these ambitious women who would help each other. So there was this disparity in my mind between ambition and helping. And this was the one place I saw it come together. And so I went through a program called Willpower, which was a year-long, basically career development program. And I was probably too senior for it at that point, but I really enjoyed the network that I got out of it and the workshops where we would sit at tables together and talk about how we wanted to accomplish things in our career. And we would encourage each other, but also really challenge each other. And so as I came up to the end of that year, I was thinking, I want to bottle this environment. This is what women need to see, that we can support each other, we can challenge each other, we can go along our ambitious paths side by side without tearing each other down. And at that point, I was actually sitting on my couch. It was Labor Day weekend. I was reading the San Francisco Chronicle, and there was this article about women's clubs and men's clubs. And men's clubs you couldn't get into unless you signed your son up when he was 5 years old. And women's clubs, you couldn't pay women to go. It was, more of a social club. It was tea and bridge, and it wasn't building careers. And I sat there and I thought, this is the problem. We need women's clubs that are making careers, that are making connections that help us advance on our leadership paths. And so I started scribbling in a notebook. I jumped on a plane for a business meeting, and I couldn't get this idea out of my head. And that ultimately became the club, which is a women's leadership organization designed around coming together in person so that you become more invested in each other's success. Like when you sit across a table from someone and you hear what she wants to accomplish, you're more inclined to help her and open up your Rolodex and make those introductions. So the club was all about bringing women together.
So there's so much that I want to ask you about. I know we're not even yet finished with your story because we haven't gotten into the law firm that you that you launched, and then ultimately your decision to move into another organization. We'll get there in a moment, but I wanted to jump into something and to pick up on a thread. So you talked about how in the early part of your career, really, throughout your education, as soon as you started to focus on the hard sciences, the path of law that you chose, even growing up, as a kid sister to two older brothers, that you spent a lot of time in environments where you might have been the only female, the only girl, or the only woman in the room. What did that experience of being the only woman in the room, what did that teach you about yourself? And what lessons did you glean from that have helped you to be successful?
So that's a great question. And as you were asking it, I had about 1,000 things go through my head. But I think that there's good and bad out of that. So I'm very comfortable in being the only female in the room because I've learned the skills that I need to make conversation and fit in. And so I feel like the positive is I can connect well with men. And that is something that I think I'm trying to do with Unraveling Pink. And I think it's something that gives me some credibility with having those conversations with men. But one thing that I observed about myself probably mid-career was that I spent the first, 8 to 10 years trying to basically show up as a male lawyer. This was a time in the mid-90s, late 90s, where women wore the man suits. Like you went into court and you didn't want to be different. You wanted everyone to see you as a lawyer, and the standard for a lawyer was a man. And so I spent the first part of my career really not being myself. And I don't think that was a good thing. It helped me succeed It helped me meet the requirements and expectations of the legal profession and my law firm and the courts. And so I think I was able to be successful in that environment because I conformed to what was expected. I hit a point where I think I had a coach who told me this story or gave me this analogy where if you are someone else at work, it's like this rubber band. Like the further you are from your natural state, the more stress you put on that rubber band, and it can either stress to the point of not bouncing back, or it can stress to the point of breaking. And that was really powerful for me to hear, because I realized that was what I was doing. I wasn't bringing my sense of humor into work. I wasn't bringing my normal personality into work. I was trying to be someone that I wasn't, just so that I could be successful in my career. And so I started not doing that. I started being myself and kind of bringing things back to who I was, and found that either we were in a different time or I didn't need to do that all along, but I was able to start being myself and still be successful in my career. So that was something that I realized I was doing that I probably should not have been doing, that I was able to later course correct.
What impact did that have on, I mean, you were successful before and you have been successful after, but what were the deeper implications for you of being comfortable showing up as you truly were and not necessarily conforming, particularly to a gendered stereotype of what a great lawyer looks like, acts like, is like? What were the deeper implications of that enlightenment or change on you?
Well, it gave me so much more energy and time.
It's exhausting to be someone else.
It is. It's, I talk about it as it's basically you have two jobs. Your first job is to show up as that expected lawyer. And the second job is just to do your job. And so if you're spending a lot of energy trying to mask who you are or be somebody that you think you're supposed to be, you're necessarily using energy that you could be using for something more constructive. So I definitely felt like I had more energy. I also was able to, I think, be a more effective lawyer. So, for example, I was a courtroom lawyer, so I would argue in front of judges and juries. And I remember one of my last, before I got out of litigation, one of my last appearances, I was in front of a judge who was probably around my age. And I basically did a dance in the courtroom. It wasn't really a dance, but I acted out what I was trying to convey in my argument.
Oh, I love it.
And
where was Facebook Live when you needed it?
And there's no way I would have done that 10 years earlier, but I was comfortable enough in who I was and who the judge was, and I felt like I could be myself. And I thought, it just popped into my head. It wasn't something I planned, but I was like, this is something I can do to illustrate what I'm trying to convey. And I still remember the look on the judge's face. He was smiling, and it looked like he was trying so hard not to laugh. And everyone in the courtroom was looking at me like I was ridiculous, but it got the point across. And that was something I was able to do in my own style and in my own way. And I think it made it much more effective than trying to just give a dry argument that I would think a typical lawyer might want to make.
It's interesting because you talk about this notion of just making the call. Look, I'm not going to be that elastic band anymore. I'm going to show up as I am. And it's easy for people, especially if you're not working in a tough environment where the standard, or where it's like, you think leader, think male kind of environment. If you don't work in that kind of environment, it feels as though the experience that you're talking about is a little bit archaic, like it's something that women don't have to deal with anymore. And yet there are lots of women who may still feel that in order for them to be successful, there is an expectation that they show up in a certain way. Now, you made the distinction whether it's just that times changed and I didn't have to, or that I could have been successful as myself all along. I'm not sure, but it worked for me. So my question for you is, based on what you've seen, do you think we're at a different point now where women don't have to behave that way or feel that pressure in order to be successful, or is there still a lot of work to do?
I think we're in a better place than we were 20 years ago. I think things have changed, and I do think that the impact the millennial generation is having is a positive one for showing up as yourself. But I still talk with a lot of women, and it may be that I'm talking with women who are of the same general age as me, and so we might have a perspective that's colored by our experiences early in our careers. But there's still this perception of showing up with a like wearing your armor to work. Or when you're in going to a conference that's men and women versus going to a conference that's all women, like the feeling is different. There's more energy needed when you're in the environment with men than when you're in an all women environment. And I felt that too. And I do think that there's a difference. And maybe men feel that as well. Certainly now with the Me Too movement, I'm sure that men are feeling much more like they have to show up with a little bit of armor on as well. And so that may just be a function of the fact that we work across gender. But I do feel like there's still a need to conform to the success metrics of the workplace. And the workplace, for the most part, was set up by men, and the success metrics were set up by men. And so I think there are lingering effects of the fact that we started out in male-dominated fields, and it takes some time to make all aspects of those cultures more balanced.
You mentioned that early on in your career, you took the opportunity to attend, women-focused events, and you just weren't getting the value. You didn't feel like they were a good use of your time. What was missing, and what specific things did you kind of take from that experience into the club?
So for me, it felt like women complaining about their lot. And I wasn't interested in that. Like, to me, if there's a problem, then we need to go solve it. And I don't have a lot of interest in sitting around and talking about how bad it is for women without also having the conversation about, okay, what can we do to change that? And I just felt like it was more of a kind of a therapy session of just complaining to each other and commiserating, which I think it's good to compare notes, but I think it's dangerous if you kind of devolve into feeding off of each other's negative energy. I think that makes things worse. And I didn't see in the events that I went to, I didn't see an emphasis on advancing professionally. And so for me, if I'm going to go spend my time at a conference or at an event, I want to learn something. I want to expand my network. I want to find some way to grow on my path. Otherwise, it's not worth my time. And when I was going to these events, it was much more like a cookie exchange or a holiday party. And there wasn't an emphasis or a focus on growing as a professional. And so those were the things that were missing for me.
So what then did you take from that experience and forge into the club? So tell us a little bit. The club has been around for 5 years, so big congratulations to you on that. So let's start, in talking about this organization that you've created. What were some of the specific, tangible, practical things that you wanted to see in the club that would help women advance professionally? So the basic requirements for joining the club are a first indication of what we were trying to accomplish. And there were basically two criteria. One is you had to either be a leader or on a path to leadership. We wanted to not make it just exclusive to executive women. We wanted to have the full
spectrum of new professionals or women who are new to business all the way up to senior women so that we could leverage that spectrum of experience. But you had to be somewhere on that leadership path. So it had to be a goal of yours to be a leader, not just to go into work and collect a paycheck and go home. The second criteria was that you had to commit to helping other women, that it couldn't be something where you come in and you take what you need and you go home. By being a club member, you're entering into a bargain where you would get the benefit of all of these women who are part of the club, but you also had to give something. And that took different forms, and it evolved over the 5 years. So we have things like mentoring programs that are, we have what's called micro-mentoring. So, for example, I've put out on my profile that's available to all club members, I'm happy to talk with anyone about what it takes to make partner in a law firm. So there's a specific topic that I know something about that I'm willing to share my knowledge with others. And so you can look for people who have targeted advice that's relevant to you and go reach out to them. We've also built different programs within the club, like an incubator program, which helps women who are already successful in their companies but are looking to develop more of a public profile. So it's focused on things like board service and developing your social media presence and communicating your value. So those types of programs, everything's focused on how can you advance on your leadership path and how can you help others within the organization.
I love it. And so tell us a little bit about some of the highlights, from these 5 years, what you're most proud of when you think about what you've built.
The things that jump out at me are, we had a launch party. We had a board of 5 people that started, and we worked for a year. This was our evening work. We all had full-time jobs. We spent a year developing the organization, and we had a launch party in October of 2012. And I presented my idea. It was the first time I publicly presented my idea. I've always presented on behalf of clients, and it was so scary because I didn't know if it would resonate with anyone. I didn't know if when I was done, I would hear crickets. And at the end, people were excited about it, and they came up to me and they said, okay, so what's the next event? And we had nothing. We had nothing planned.
You tell us.
It was all we could do. Yeah. It was all we could do to get the launch party together. And so then we, the next day, we're like, okay, we got to plan something. What are we going to do next? And so it was really fun to see the enthusiasm for it and to see people, just the hunger for coming together and inspiring each other. So that was one highlight. And then another was probably about 2 years in, one of the members, Lorraine McKinnon, who's now the president of the club, she came to me and she said, can I talk to you about something related to the club? And in my head, I was thinking, oh no, she's going to ask me to do something that's going to be a lot of work, because typically people say, oh, here, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And we had coffee, and she had the idea for the incubator, which is now in its 3rd year. And she said, this is my vision for it, and I'd like to build it. And I just wanted to hug her, because that's what it's all about. The whole point of a leadership organization is to take leadership and to grow those skills. And the fact that she had put so much thought and effort into what this program might look like, and that she wanted to build it, was absolutely amazing. And so that was another highlight. And then it's just occasionally I will get an email or run into somebody who just tells me some impact that the club has had on them. And it is heartwarming to know that people are actually getting something beneficial out of it and making strong connections and friendships and growing in their careers.
Yeah, I think that moment of having somebody else say, yes, you founded this, and here's this valuable thing I want to do, and guess what? I'm prepared to run with it. I mean, that would bring tears of joy
right
to the eyes of any founder. I love that story. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating about the impact that women are having having on the world of work is this idea of changing metrics. And, you talked about how so much of the world of work was really created by men for men. And, in different organizations and in different ways, I see women having an impact in making shifts, sometimes significant and sometimes subtle, yet still profound in the metrics that we use to measure success. Now, I know for you, there was a point in your career at which your definition of success changed. Can you tell us about that? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, so I was at a large law firm at the time. I had been there for 15 years, and I remember sitting in my office one day and realizing that by all of those measures of success, I was successful. I had my own clients. I was a first chair trial attorney. I was making good money. I was respected by my peers. And and then I realized I wasn't happy. And I think the legal profession allows you to just sort of jump on the train and go without putting a whole lot of thought into where you're going. If you are, reasonably competent, you can navigate the requirements to become a senior associate and a partner and move up the ranks fairly readily. It's more challenging now, I think, but you could just hop on the train and go. And so I hadn't really given any thought as I was moving up the ladder about whether that's really what I wanted. And I realized that I wasn't happy in what I was doing. I wasn't really learning much. It wasn't as challenging as it had been. And the things that I thought I liked about litigation, I didn't really enjoy anymore. And so I was having dinner with a couple friends in my backyard, and we were all sort of at a point in our careers where we weren't happy. And we started talking about the things that made us happy and decided that we would undertake an experiment. And we called it the Joy Experiment. And for a month, we would track, just individually on our own, we would track what made us happy, what gave us joy. And I also started tracking what did not give me joy, like the things I would want to avoid. And after a month, we came back together and we had dinner again, and we compared notes. And it was really interesting to go through that experience and see the threads of what came together. And what ultimately came out of this was the three of us started a law firm. We were three lawyers in different places in our careers, but all the same age and all looking for something different. And we decided to start a law firm where joy was at the focus of it. So we had things like, if you go on vacation, you really go on vacation, and everyone covers for you. So you can actually take that time off and decompress. We had, as part of our standing partner meeting, the any unjoys that we had. So basically, if you had an administrative task that was driving you nuts, you would put it on the table, and maybe someone would rather do that than something that gave them an unjoy. And
oh so my gosh, trading unjoys. I love it.
It gave us this vocabulary and a metric around something that we all valued that enabled us to have conversations to maximize the joy in our jobs. And so that was something that I encourage people whenever I hear that they're not happy in their jobs, like, oh, you should do the joy experiment. Go try it and see what comes out of it. You never know.
One of the things that is going through my head and has been the whole time, I've been interviewing you is a word, and that word is initiative. So it's this idea of taking initiative, of when things aren't working, when you recognize that there's a problem, of figuring out, what am I really feeling? What is the real problem here? And then taking initiative to do something else, to create something that solves a problem, to try something, to figure it out, to come up with an alternative, to do an experiment. Where does that initiative come from? Like, when you think back on the experiences that have shaped you, where does this commitment to initiative come from? Because there's so many people out there who they notice that those low level things that are causing them, like ongoing low level dissatisfaction like a toothache, but they don't feel that same empowerment to be able to change it. So where does your initiative come from? What experience or, or theme or lesson did you learn that really has driven that theme throughout your life?
Wow. Oh my gosh. I don't know. I'm trying to think of can I think of the earliest memory I have of taking initiative? And I don't know. I guess the only thing I could come up with is I think my parents always had high expectations. And when you're trying to meet those expectations, sometimes you have to get creative in how you get there. But I don't know. It might also come from, I played a lot of competitive sports growing up, and you have to find ways to overcome momentum sometimes. And as long as I can remember, I was always one of the leaders on the team. It may just be that I like to be in control. I don't know. I don't know. That's a really good question. I can't pinpoint one thing. And as I reflect on my life, I can't think of a time when I wasn't. I mean, I was a pretty intense child, so it happened pretty early.
Well, and I'm hoping for people who are listening to this interview that's one of the takeaways, because I think, this idea and it, of course, the joy experiment just exemplifies it. Like, you realize there's a problem. You take some time to figure out, what is the problem? How long has this been going on? How serious is it? So much more fun when you have friends and you're doing it outside over dinner, and then coming up with an experimental way to address it. And out of that came your law firm. So moving on to that law firm, that's not where you are anymore. What happened and what made you decide to go and work with a startup?
Well, so when I was with HIP Legal, one of the services that we were starting to offer was we'd come into a company's facility one day a week and just sort of be on site. And if they used us, great. And if they didn't, we wouldn't charge them. But the idea was that there are, there are a lot of legal issues that people think about on a daily basis, but if there's not someone right there, they're less inclined to pick up the phone and call because they feel like, oh, it's probably just a small thing. And so I wanted to be on site where I could help more and I could help identify issues early. And Avagant was, at the time, the CEO was a former client of mine, and I had worked with him before, and he had some projects that I helped him with, and he was starting to think about hiring a GC. He felt like he needed more on-site legal support. He had not had a lawyer there before, and so he tried out the one-day-a-week thing, which turned into really doing 3 days of work for 1 day's pay.
I know, we all know how that story goes.
I said, that doesn't quite work for me. I'd like to get paid for my work. And he said, I think we could use your full time. Would you like to come on? And that was tough because, having built something with my partners, I didn't want to abandon that. And I didn't want to abandon them. But I did realize when I was working with Avagant that I liked being closer to the business. I do like the business side, and you don't get as close to that when you're outside counsel. And so I started thinking about it more seriously, and I talked with my partners at HIP Legal, and the response was just amazing. They both basically said, we started this firm with the concept of finding the joy in our profession, and if going to Avagant is what gives you the joy in your next step of your career, then you should do that. And so I made the decision to go. It was tough and, transitioned a lot of work before I went out to Avagant. But their support was from the foundation of how we started the firm, from the joy that we were all trying to find in our careers, which I thought was a really nice way to end my time there.
I want to wrap up by asking you, who inspires you and why?
So I'm inspired by a few different people. None of them are celebrities. I'm not really inspired by celebrity people. I'm not sure why, but
not even Beyonce. Not even Beyonce.
Well, I mean, there is Beyonce.
That's right. Exactly. She's in her own category. I'm teasing.
Yeah. So one person who inspires me is a good friend of mine, Joanna Bloor, and she has a company where she helps people find their awesome and convey it. And what inspires me about her is that she's constantly learning and challenging. And whenever I spend time with her, I almost feel like I have to prepare for an interview, like a job interview, like that level of preparation, even though she's one of my best friends. But because I know she'll challenge me. She won't let me off the hook. And if I say something, she'll follow it up and she'll have all these ideas and she'll be ready to introduce me to someone. And I have to be ready for that.
Oh, and that's a good friend.
Yeah, she's amazing. And the other people who inspire me are actually my coworkers at Avogant. So I work with a lot of young engineers, young and old engineers, not old, but older.
Yep.
And
more mature,
young and mature engineers. And this is my first time really working with tech folks other than lawyers who have tech backgrounds. And what strikes me about them is they're always trying to solve problems. And so you don't get to just complain about something at the lunch table and think that that's the end of it, or someone's going to commiserate with you and then it's the end of it. They start talking about how to solve the problem. And so I was actually talking about my frustrations with audio quality on my podcast and not being able to find a good place to record and all this. And I was not thinking of building anything, but they start talking about building a soundproof room or just a frame that you could take down when you're not recording. And it just struck me that they're moving on to solutions. Their minds are thinking in such a way that a casual conversation could become a new company or a new idea or a new product. And that way of thinking is so foreign to what I grew up with in the legal profession that I am constantly inspired by them.
That's super inspiring. I have had that same conversation with people. I need to go have it with different people and come up with a new recording booth. I love it. Yeah, that's a great group. Yes. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And I mean, we really haven't talked that much about your show, Unraveling Pink. It is a fabulous podcast. Maybe you can share with listeners where we can go. What if people want to learn more about you, they want to take a listen to the show, learn more about the work that you're doing, where can we go to find you? Where would you direct us?
So you can find the show on unravelingpink.com. It's unraveling with one L. I discovered you can actually spell it two ways. Only has one L. I also have a personal website, annierogaski.com, not quite as updated, and I'm on LinkedIn. And Unraveling Pink is, there's also a Twitter feed that's at Unraveling Pink, and I'm at Annie Rogaski on Twitter.
All right. AnnieRogaski.com, UnravelingPink.com. Those are two great places to start. Annie Rogaski, thank you so much for joining us on Fierce Feminine Leadership.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Fierce Feminine Leadership. Be sure to head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. While you're there, leave us a fierce review. When you leave a review, your name is automatically entered into a monthly draw. Each month, we'll draw one reviewer to automatically receive a private coaching session with women's leadership expert Eleanor Beaton. So remember, head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. Then leave us a review for your chance to win a private coaching session with Eleanor Beaton. Go to eleanorbeatonpodcast.com and sign up to get your free cheat sheet, the 5 critical leadership skills of 7-figure businesswomen. This free download will help you diagnose the exact skills you need to see major growth in your business and career. Head over to eleanorbeatonpodcast.com and get your free download today.